Alright guys, Darren from Honest Money, and in this video we're going to be building my very first mining rig. So in last week's video I mentioned that all of the parts, the chassis has now finally arrived, and we're building it on the floor because this thing is pretty sharp, so I didn't want to scratch up my desk. So I'm going to start building the rig and document it as I go, and hopefully you guys will find it useful if you do decide to build your own rigs. So the first part we are going to unbox is the motherboard. So I went for the Asus Prime Z390A, and there are two reasons I went for this motherboard. Number one, it was actually in stock, so getting mining motherboards at the moment is very, very difficult. And two, it has an onboard M2 slot, which means I can put the hard drive or the solid state drive directly onto the motherboard without requiring additional cables. And when you're building a mining rig, there are lots of cables, so doing away with one cable is a bonus. So there are 6 GPU slots or 6 PCI slots that support GPUs on this motherboard. So you can see them there. They are different sizes, but that doesn't make any difference. And you'll see that later when I connect the risers. So next up, we're going to install the CPU or the processor. So I've gone for a Core i5. If I could have got an i3, I would have. This motherboard is too new to be compatible with some of the older Pentiums and Celerons. So I had to go for an i3 or an i5. And the i5 was the only one that I could get was in stock. It also comes with a heatsink and fan, and I'm going to go with the stock heatsink and fan as we're not going to be pushing it too hard. And also you can see the thermal paste on the bottom there. We're going to leave that in place. So if we were going to be pushing this CPU hard as maybe as part of a gaming rig, you might want to put on your own thermal paste, but as part of this mining rig, the standard paste will be absolutely fine. So that is the CPU slot you can see, or the CPU socket on the motherboard. All we need to do is unclip the bar, open it. There's currently a protective cover on top which stops any dust from getting into the socket. You can see there in the top left and top right corner there are 2 little grooves to make sure it only goes in one way, and in the bottom left corner there is a gold triangle again just to ensure you put this CPU in the correct way round. But once you've popped that CPU in position, it should just slot into place. As you pull back down the metal clip to keep it in place, the plastic cover should pop off. You can remove the plastic cover manually, but I just do it this way, and then the plastic cover will pop off as you pin the bar down. So the CPU install is really, really easy. There's nothing to be afraid of with that. Just be very careful and handle the CPU from the side. And if your CPU has lots of pins on the bottom, be careful not to bend any. So now we're going to install the heatsink and fan, as you want to keep the CPU cool. Never boot your motherboard or your PC without the heatsink and fan installed, as you can toast your CPU pretty quickly. So we need to put that onto the motherboard. So this heatsink is really easy to install. There are 4 holes. So just line up those 4 holes and just literally push down, and that is it. And at the end there, I'm just pointing out where I need to connect the fan itself to the motherboard to get power to the fan. So the first thing I do is connect the power connector, but you can do that afterwards. So I've connected the power to the motherboard, and now I'm just going to pick up the motherboard and push on opposing corners initially. I've picked it up because I didn't want to push down too hard on the box, and then I've had to replace it so I can put the pressure down without putting too much bend on the motherboard, and then I just do the 2 following corners. And as you can see from looking at the underneath of the motherboard, you can see the 4 plastic clips I've just pushed through from the heatsink, and it really is as easy as that. So don't be scared about installing your CPU or heatsink and fan, as it is usually very straightforward, despite the fact it can be quite daunting for someone that is new to working with PC components. And you can see on the top there, I'm just showing that I haven't actually lined up the 4 plastic push-throughs yet. So once I pop the motherboard back down, I just need to twist those to make sure that they're fully locked into place. So up next, we're going to install the RAM. So we've got 8 GB in total. So this is DDR RAM, so you run it in pairs. So RAM is also really easy to install. All you need to do is ensure it's the correct way round. So you can see the slot in the middle. So one end is slightly longer than the other. So just make sure you line it up on the motherboard. Now, this will vary from motherboard to motherboard, but because they're going to be running in dual, you don't necessarily put them in slots 1 and 2. So on my motherboard, I needed to put the first RAM stick in slot 1, and then the second RAM stick will go into slot 3. And the same as if you were installing additional modules, it'd be maybe 2 and 4. So just check with your motherboard, but usually it'll be 1 and 3 will be the first place you'll put in the first 2 sticks. And as you put them into the motherboard and push them down, the clips on either end will pull together and lock the RAM into place. So up next, we're going to install the solid state drive. So I've got a 500 GB one, which is a massive overkill for a mining rig, but it's the cheapest one at the time. And the bit I just highlighted on the motherboard is the M2 slot.
So I'm just unscrewing the heatsink at the moment, so that will help the hard drive stay cool. It shouldn't really be an issue in this rig. Anyway, this is a mining rig, so it's going to be the GPUs doing the work, not the hard drive. But I'm just going to undo this heatsink so you can see where the M2 SSD is going to connect directly to the motherboard. So like I said, the bonus with this motherboard is I don't need any cables to actually connect the M2 SSD directly to the motherboard. So the heatsink comes with some thermal paste underneath, so you just need to remove that protective sticker, which I'm going to do, and then that will be ready to attach directly to the top of the solid state drive. As you can see there, you've got some lovely thermal paste ready to go. So I'm just going to pop that to one side at the moment, as there are a few extra steps to go through when installing a M2 drive directly onto the motherboard. So as you can see, it is a lot smaller than you might have expected when you saw the size of the box. Solid state drives are generally very, very small, and this one especially is really small. So this little screw and stand here, this would have come with your motherboard. So when you open your motherboard, check through, there'll be a tiny bag with this tiny screw and stand. So you can see that I just offered the SSD up to the motherboard to figure out which of the screw slots I need to use. So now I know the correct length, I know where to put the stand in that I just showed you, so that when I put the SSD onto the motherboard, I can then screw it down at the correct length. So that's the stand in place. Now I can reinstall the SSD. And if I've put it in the right slot, which I have, the screw will then go directly into that stand that I just showed you to keep it at the correct position and lock it into place. So when you're tightening up the screws, don't do them too tight. I just do everything finger tightness. And this applies to pretty much everything you'll do when working with components, is don't over tighten anything. Finger tightness is usually absolutely fine. So the hard drive is actually installed. So now we're just going to pop on the heatsink. And there are two screws either end of the heatsink, so make sure you get it lined up so the thermal paste is nicely positioned on top of the SSD. And the screws, what I normally do is just put them in very loosely to start with so that I can get it fully aligned before I then go ahead to proceed to screw both screws fully down and bring us to the completion of this part of the build. So you can see at this stage we have the fan and heatsink installed on top of the CPU, and the power connector to the fan is connected to the motherboard. We also have the two memory sticks installed directly into the motherboard in the correct slots, and we've got the M2 SSD installed into the M2 slot under the heatsink. So the next step is to put the motherboard onto the chassis. So what I'm doing is offering it up to see which of the brass standoffs I'm actually going to be using. So these chassis are usually made by private individuals rather than big companies, so that aren't always going to line up. So I just needed to offer it up and figure out which one of these brass standoffs to remove, as I didn't want the brass standoffs to be sticking into just random parts of the motherboard unless it's actually going to be used for a standoff and there's going to be a screw going into it. So I just popped the chassis upside down so I could remove the screw from the two standoffs that I wanted to remove. And then when I actually come to install the motherboard, you can see that I'm only going to be using 5 of the brass standoffs instead of the original 7 that were installed when the chassis first arrived. So you can see that those are the standoffs. It's just a brass standoff with the screw underneath that holds it in position. So in this step, I'm just taking the motherboard and just turning it around so I can make sure the holes are lined up correctly, popping it on to the chassis. And then the chassis itself, I'm using the screws that come with the chassis. So earlier on in the video, before I actually started recording, I removed the screws. So those screws I'm just going to use now to connect the motherboard and hold it in position onto the chassis. So when I start connecting everything else to the motherboard, it doesn't move around all over the place. So I'm just going to speed up the footage now because no one really wants to see me putting in 5 or 6 screws in real time, as we will be here all day. So again, start from different sides. So don't just go around in a clockwise motion, go from different positions to try and push it down in as balanced way as possible. And then at the very end, just go around and make sure that all of the screws are fully secured. Again, only to finger tightness. Do not over tighten things. So the next thing I'm going to do is put on the power switch. So here we have a power switch, a reset switch, and then you've got a power light and a hard drive light. So the other end, you've got these cables look really complicated, but actually on the motherboard, you'll see connectors labeled exactly the same there. So you've got the power, the reset, the LED for the power, and the LED for the hard drive. So I'm just going to go down and zoom in onto the motherboard, and you can see here the pins are labeled underneath. So on the left hand side, you've got the power LED and the HD LED, and next to that you've got the power switch and the reset switch as well. So those are the pins I'm going to be using. So just make sure you use the correct connector to the correct pin. But again, it's something that's really easy. Just take your time and make sure things are lined up correctly as you push them down, and just a tiny bit of cable management there to keep the power switch out of the way whilst I do the rest of this build. So up next, we're going to install the first PSU, the power supply. So I've got a Corsair RM750, which actually works out cheaper to buy two slightly smaller PSUs than it does to buy a bigger one. So this is capable of 750 watts of power, whereas in total, I want 1500 watts for this rig. So I'm going to be running two PSUs together. You can see on the back there where the power connector goes in. And also, don't forget that you have to turn your PCUs on, otherwise you won't be able to turn on your rig. So that's why I pointed it out on that part of the video. So the PSU is onto the chassis now, and each PSU comes with lots of different cables, which I'm going to cover as we go through the rest of this build. But the one on top there is the power cable. I'm just going to pop that towards the back of the build for now. So this cable here is the ATX cable, which is the motherboard cable. So this is the main cable that's going to connect your PSU to your motherboard to provide power to your motherboard. So that end can only go one way round, and that applies to all of these cables. They can only go one way round. So you can see on the back of the motherboard, we've got a socket ready for that cable to go into. So this cable can be a little bit stiff, so I'm just going to wiggle it in initially, and then I'm going to use both hands so I can support the motherboard as I continue to push it into place. And again, we're trying to do a tiny bit of cable management at this stage to put it through the most optimal route and then connect it to the PSU. So the second PSU won't connect directly to the motherboard, but I'll explain that later in the video. And the other end, again, you'll look at the end of the cable and it will be pretty clear which socket it needs to plug into on the PSU. But that is the ATX power cable that connects the PSU to the motherboard. So up next, we're going to take a look at the risers. Now, the risers are really important as there isn't enough space on the motherboard to mount the graphics cards directly onto the motherboard. So what the riser will allow us to do is to mount the graphics cards above the motherboard in a separate area so there's more space around them. Now the risers do come with some Velcro cable tidies, which I'll be using later on in the build to try and tidy things up as much as possible, but you're never going to have a fully tidy mining rig as there are so many cables involved. So I'm just going to empty out the first riser to show you how this works. So at the bottom, we have the card that plugs into the PCI slot. So instead of your graphics cards plugging into the motherboard, that plugs into the motherboard. And then there's a USB cable that connects that card that plugs into the motherboard to the riser, which is going to connect to the bottom of the GPU. So that's the riser there, which will plug onto the bottom of the graphics card. And you have a few different power options. You've got the Molex connector, you've got the 6-pin connector, which is what we're going to be using, and then you have SATA as well, which I'd recommend avoiding using. The 6-pin option is the best choice. Molex is okay, but you definitely want to avoid SATA as it can overheat. But we're going to be using PCI, so we're going to be using the 6-pin connection to power this riser. So on the other end, the actual card, make sure it goes around the correct way. You can see there are different widths, so get it around the correct way before you push it into the motherboard. It should go in really, really easily. Unfortunately, as it's a lot shorter than the actual slots, it doesn't click into place, so be careful they don't come loose as you're doing the rest of this build. So up next, we're going to install the first graphics card. So you can see there the riser is ready to go onto the bottom of the graphics card. So let's take one of these GPUs, we'll unbox it, we'll put it into position and then connect the riser to the bottom of it. So for this build, we're using 2060s, which are a graphics card from a year or two ago. They aren't overly powerful, but at the same time, they offered a really good return on investment as they'll pay for themselves quite quickly. And also allowed me to try this whole building a mining rig without spending an absolute fortune. You can see on the bottom of the GPU there is a protective cover, so make sure you pop that off or you will have trouble plugging it into your riser. So this rig cost me just under £4,000 and I talked about it in more detail in the previous video and I'll link to that in the top comment. So if you haven't watched that, I would strongly recommend watching it after this video. So the next thing to do is to actually install the GPU onto the chassis. So just undo the screw at the top, line up the hole and put the screw back in. So initially I just put it back to finger tightness so that I can still wiggle the graphics card a little bit as I install the riser onto the bottom. Then later on I'll go through and manually tighten up all of the GPU screws with a screwdriver. And as you can see, once you've unpopped the clip on the bottom of the riser, all you need to do is slide it in and just push it, and it very easily will clip onto the bottom of the graphics card. And these risers had some padding as well, so there's some padding between the bottom of that graphics card and the chassis, which is really nice, especially as this device is going to be running 24/7. Up next, we're going to take a look at the PCI cables. So these have an 8-pin connector one end, which goes directly into the PSU. And then on the other end, you also have 8 pins, but they're split 6 and 2. So depending on what they're plugging into, you either push them together for 8-pin or you leave them separate for 6 pins. So I'm going to be using these to power both the GPU and the risers, as these risers are powered. So each GPU and riser will need its own connector. So I'm just going to show you the connections on the PSU. So you've got 4 slots on the top row, the 8-pin slots, and there's also one on the bottom. So there's 5 8-pin sockets on the PSU. And the plan is to connect each socket to each graphics card. So you've got an 8-pin on the top, so we'll push the 6 and 2 together. And then the split off 6-pin will power the riser. So I want to power 1 graphics card and riser per PCI cable. At least that was the plan. But as you'll see, as I plug in the first graphics card, so I plug in the 8-pin into the PSU and then push a 6 and 2 together to plug into the top of the graphics card. So effectively another 8-pin plugs into the top of the graphics card. However, the split off cable, which I was going to use to plug in 6 pins into the PCI riser, it isn't actually long enough to reach the bottom and actually reach to the riser. So I've had to order some extension cables so that I can run it as I want to, which is 1 cable per graphics card and riser. But for now, I'm just using an additional PCI cable and just plugging in a 6-pin. So I'm not using the 2, just the 6-pin straight into the riser, and that will power that graphics card. Now, for those of you that have built a rig or a PC before, you may have noticed that I haven't plugged in the CPU power yet. So the CPU cable is also 8-pin, but it can only be used for the CPU. So you can't use this as a PCIe cable to power other components. So plug one end into the CPU slot on the motherboard, and the other end will go into any of the 8-pin sockets that we showed you on the PSU just a moment ago. But make sure you don't use that to try and plug into your GPU or your riser, because it's not designed for that. It is only for the CPU. So I'm just going to plug that into the power supply, and then I'm going to install all of the other GPUs into the chassis with the risers ready for when the cables that I've ordered arrive, and then I can install them properly. In the meantime, I'm just going to use the PCIe cables that I've actually got and try to get some of these graphics cards working so I can boot it for the first time, try and get Windows set up, get NiceHash set up, and actually see if this thing is going to mine. So you can see here we've got an 8-pin plugged in at the top. The other 6+2 is spare at the moment because it doesn't reach the riser. So what I've done instead is just use 1 PCIe cable to power both risers. So you can see there, it's kind of daisy chains between the 2 risers at the bottom. So that is just a temporary solution, because when I get the extension cables, each PCIe cable is going to power 1 graphics card and 1 riser. And then each graphics card is currently running off of a separate PCIe cable, or I could have done the same with the graphics cards as I did with the risers and power both graphics cards off of 1 PCIe cable. Also, before I can plug this in and turn it on for the first time, I need to put in a Wi-Fi adapter so I can get some signal. And also, so I can actually carry out the install process, I need a mouse and keyboard. So I'm just going to plug in the USB fob for my mouse and keyboard. This is off my main PC, so I'm just temporarily using them to set up this rig. And now we can start connecting it up to the monitor. So we've got HDMI out there, which is going to make use of the onboard graphics. So we're not plugging in the monitor to any of the GPUs, we're plugging it into the motherboard. And we've got the power switch there ready to go. So on the back of the PSU, just remember, like I said earlier, flick the PSU on once you've powered it on. Otherwise, when you press the power button, it won't actually turn on. So let's pop this under the desk and try and boot this up for the very first time. So you can see there the HDMI is now plugged in. So if things work, we'll be able to see the display once I turn it on. And we've got the power cable plugged into the back of the PSU. And finally, I'm going to flick that switch on the PSU as I want to try and turn this thing on. So here we are, we're going to press the yellow and white one as that was the power, and fingers crossed, if everything goes to plan, this will boot up. So firstly, PSU on, we want power to the rig, and it's a promising sign so far. As you can see, the lights have come on the motherboard, so we haven't booted yet, but the motherboard has shown it's got power, and you can see the lights at the back as well. So we've definitely got power to the rig. Let's press the power button and see if this thing boots on. So here we go again, press the switch. And you can see there straight away the fan on the heatsink has fired up, which is a really promising sign. The PSU fan will probably be spinning as well, as you can see. Yep, and the 2 GPUs that are connected are also spinning. The fans are going. So just going to look at the other 4. They will be off because they're not connected. So they will be working at some point. But for now, until the extension cables arrive, those cables are disconnected. So things did boot up. And as you can see, you've got the Intel i5 has been installed successfully. You also got the 8 GB of RAM has also been installed. You've got the keyboard and mouse, which have been detected, and the M2 solid state drive has also been detected. So the next thing we need to do is create a flash drive so we can install an operating system onto this mining rig. So what I'm going to do now is show you how to get Windows 10 set up. So Windows 10 is free. There are other operating systems that you can use to run your mining rig, but for most of us, start with Windows 10 initially, and then you can work your way up from there. So Windows 10 you can download for free. So if you just search for Windows Creator Tool on Google, that will bring you to this page and you can download the tool, and this will allow you to create a bootable flash drive. So you're just going to create a pen drive with Windows 10 on it that you can then plug in, turn on the PC, and the install should start. So I'm choosing, I want to create installation media, so I'm going to be creating a USB flash drive. You go through the options, so I just use the recommended options, but you can untick that if you want to change what you're doing. Then you click the next button, then you actually choose whether you want to install it onto a USB flash drive, which I do. It must be at least 8 GB, and I'd recommend formatting it as well. And you can see there my USB drive has been detected straight away. So just hit the next button, then that will start installing the application that will be a self-installer onto that USB pen drive. So then when we boot up the device, it will be ready to start installing Windows. So I'm doing this on a working device. I'm doing this on my main PC at the moment. So I'm creating the flash drive on another device, and then I'll plug it into the mining rig when I'm ready to boot it up again. So this is just going to go through. I fast forwarded the footage. Windows is never that quick. So the flash drive is ready, so I'm ready to plug it into the mining rig and boot it up, and we'll see what happens. So I've plugged in the Windows 10 flash drive and I've rebooted the mining rig. Now if your flash drive isn't detected straight away, you may need to go into your BIOS and change the order of your boot devices. But by default on this Asus motherboard, it is trying to boot from the flash device as the first primary device. And as we can see here, the Windows 10 installation screen has popped up. Now I'm filming this using the camera rather than the screen capture, as I can't actually do screen capture until Windows is set up. So I'm trying to get the best picture I can using this camera. But really, most of this stuff is fairly logical to go through yourself. Just choose I don't have a product key. You can activate it later if you want. If not, even if you don't activate Windows, it will still continue to run absolutely fine on your mining rig. Now, I always choose Windows 10 Pro for the version I like to install, as that's what I'm used to working with. And then have a quick read through of the license terms, tick the box, and then hit the next button. And then you want to choose custom install Windows only. So you're not upgrading, you're doing a full clean install Windows. So choose the custom option at the bottom. The hard drive should automatically select, and then hit the next button. Windows will then start copying over the files and preparing the installation process. This doesn't take too long. There might be a reboot or two as it goes through that process. You can then start the install, so choose your region. So we're in the UK, so we're going to go with United Kingdom. Each step is fairly logical, so even without this guide, you should be absolutely fine. Choose your relevant keyboard layout. Do you want to add a second keyboard? No, we don't. Do you want to connect to Wi-Fi? Yes, we do. So your Wi-Fi should pop up if you're not using an Ethernet connection. Now, I did have some issues with Wi-Fi, which I'm going to cover at the end of this video, as you have to be very careful when using Wi-Fi on a mining rig. But they entered the Wi-Fi password, connected up, and let the install process proceed further. And then how would you like to use the setup? Just choose use for personal use, hit the next button. You can either add your existing account or set up a new one. I personally chose to set up a new account as I didn't want my old existing account associated with the mining rig. So enter your email address for the separate account. So you might want to create a Gmail address for this, so it's completely separate to your own personal account. Then choose next. Enter the password for that account as well, and then it also asks you to choose your region and date of birth with the most unuser-friendly date of birth selector I've ever seen. You also need to enter a PIN number that you're going to use to log in to Windows. So enter your PIN number twice there. I keep mine nice and short to make logging in as simple as possible. And then go through all of the usual options. So do you want Microsoft to use your location? Choose no. This is just going to be a mining rig, so there's no benefit to choosing yes for this. Choose the accept, and the same for find my device, choose no. And that applies to pretty much all of the things you'll see during this setup. Just choose no because you don't need them. In terms of diagnostic data, just choose send required data only. No, you don't want to use improve inking and typing. There are so many of these screens when installing Windows. Do you want a tailored experience? No, you don't want a tailored experience with diagnostic data. Hit the accept button. And then do you want apps to use advertising ID? You don't care because hopefully you're not going to see any ads, as this is just going to be mining away in the background. And do you want to use your phone from your PC? Just choose skip for now, as you don't need to set this up from this device. So, and finally, do you want to use Cortana? Choose not now, as you're not going to use Cortana for mining, unfortunately. Then once that's all done, Windows should finally start to boot. So you see it's got everything ready for you. It's going to be the first proper boot into Windows. So thank you for sticking with me so far during this video. We're nearly there, almost there, Windows. And here we are, the very first boot into Windows. So the first thing we all do once we go into Windows is open up Bing and download Chrome or the browser of choice. So I'm downloading Chrome as I'm going to use that for remote desktop so I can connect to this device without a screen once it's put into its final position. So that's why I'm using Chrome, because I want to use the remote desktop feature. Now while I'm downloading Chrome, I also went onto Windows Update and disabled the automatic update. So you can actually pause updates for up to a month. So you can see there I've just zoomed in quite badly and delayed the updates until the end of the following month. And also at the top, set it to off, that it would download updates for other Microsoft products when updating Windows. I then went to NiceHash.com so I could download the QuickMiner. That is what you want to use if you've got NVIDIA devices. If you're using AMD devices, then you'll need to download the traditional NiceHash mining tool, as that supports that. So if you haven't got an account, sign up for one. If not, you can just log in and you can download the QuickMiner tool. Now, once it's downloaded, when you try and run it, if you face the error that I did here, you can't actually read what the error says. It basically says it's not detecting the graphics cards. I needed to actually update my drivers because all I've done is install Windows. So I'm going to go to the NVIDIA site, or should I go to Google first, search for the latest NVIDIA drivers, download the installation tool, and then that will allow me to install the latest drivers for all of the GPUs that I've got installed. And then by using the latest drivers, it will then support NiceHash QuickMiner, which is the easiest mining tool to use. And it's literally just a click of a button to get things running. So it's worth the effort to download the latest NVIDIA drivers, as it will make working with NiceHash and the QuickMiner so much easier. It does take a bit of time to download as the drivers are quite big, but you can see that NiceHash is now running and it is mining away in the background. Now, one thing you'll probably need to do as well is to change your VRAM settings. So just go onto YouTube and Google how to change Windows 10 VRAM settings. But what you want to do is to change them to match the total of your graphics card. So I've got 6 graphics cards, all with 6GB each. So I'm going to set mine at just over 36GB. I've actually put 37GB in this instance. And that is what you want to do, is match your VRAM to the total memory on all of your graphics cards combined. Then NiceHash shouldn't have any issues and should run smoothly in the background without pop-ups warning you about the VRAM memory limits, which I kept getting when I first started running the QuickMiner. So before I take you into NiceHash and show you the rig running, I just want to show you the final rig minus a few cables. So I've had to kind of hack this together until the correct cables arrive. So the graphics card here is small enough to actually use without an extension cable. As you can see there, I've got the one GPU running off the one PCI cable with the 8 pin at the top and a 6 pin at the bottom. So that's my plan for all 6 of those graphics cards. But whilst I'm waiting for those additional cables to arrive, I've just split each PCI cable in 2. So one is running 2 risers and one is running 2 GPUs. And this one here is actually going to show you the extension cable I do have. So I'm waiting for 5 more of those connectors to arrive. I ordered 6 and the company sent me 1. So I'm waiting for the other 5 to arrive. And then the final 2, you can see they are split at the top and split at the bottom. So all of the cables are in place. The mining rig does work. I've also installed the second PSU. Just a quick note on the PSU, make sure you run the graphics card and riser from the same PSU. So I've got 3 graphics cards and 3 risers off the left-hand PSU and 3 graphics cards and 3 risers off the right-hand PSU. Now this cable here is the ATX cable, which on the first PSU I plugged into the motherboard. Whereas this one here, I plug into this little module here, which is called an Add to PSU module. And what that does is when the first PSU is turned on, it triggers the second PSU to come on as well. So rather than plugging into the motherboard like the first PSU does, and that's where it gets the signal from, instead the second PSU gets a signal from this device that it should turn on. And as I move this over, you'll see on the other side, we've actually got a Molex connector with a cable going all the way back to the first PSU. And what happens is when the first PSU is powered on, the power goes down that cable, it signals the module, and then it signals the second PSU to come on at the same time. So that's how those are connected up. And the module only costs £10 or £15, so it's well worth getting because it saves having to manually boot the second PSU every time that you need to reboot the mining rig. So you can see all 6 of the GPUs are now fully installed. I'm just going to zoom out a bit so you can see me turn this on for the first time with all 6 GPUs. So now we've got the 2 PSUs we have to turn on the first one. We also have to flick on the switch on the second one as well. And then if all goes to plan, once we press the power switch, all of this should come to life. So you can see there, I've actually got it tidied on there now with a cable tidy. So I'm going to press the yellow switch again. And you can see we've got the green light comes on straight away, which is a positive sign. and hopefully all 6 GPUs are now spinning, which shows that not only are the 6 GPUs working, both power supplies are working and all 6 risers are working as well. So just a final note on the build, you can see here that my Wi-Fi device is now on an extension cable. So basically the GPUs create so much interference that if your Wi-Fi device is too close, it knocks out the Wi-Fi. So I had to get an extension cable. So if you are using Wi-Fi and you're having issues, try an extension cable to get the Wi-Fi device well away from the actual mining rig itself. So finally, here we are logged into NiceHash. At this point, the rig has been running for around 4 or 5 days, mining around in the background. You can see that it's generated around £48 in Bitcoin, although technically we're not mining in Bitcoin, we're mining in the most profitable one, then NiceHash will pay out in Bitcoin. So we've generated around about £48 in 4 to 5 days, which isn't too bad at all, considering this rig only cost just under £4,000. And if you go through to the rig details, you can see here we've got a hash rate of 192, and all 6 of the GPUs have been overclocked and underpowered. So you can see we've got the 6 RTX 2060 GPUs, all recognized, all running at around 31 to 32 hash rate, and their power consumption is really low as well, which means there's more chance that I can make a good profit as I'm not spending too much on electricity. So that wraps things up for my first ever mining rig build. I hope you guys found it useful. This video took a long time to put together, so I'd really appreciate it if you can scroll down and hit that like button. If you want to see more from me, subscribe to the channel. And if you've got any comments or suggestions about these builds, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.